If you ever wonder what the process of making an animated short for a company or a client looks like, then you're gonna love this video. We started our very own animation studio this year, and right away we were approached by our very first paying client. They wanted us to create an animation promoting the main character of their IP coming to life. And so this is how we made Bob Awakens. We needed a good idea of what the client wanted exactly. So we started asking for references and inspirations, things like style, color palette, locations, and any other animations that they've seen that they really liked. We started asking for that right away to try and get an idea of what exactly they wanted. We also tried to understand what the story of the character was and what their IP was so that we can create a lore accurate animation for them. And once we had a good idea of what they wanted, we began work. Now, we were a very small team and we only had a couple of months to finish the entire project. So we had to be very efficient with our time. Now, while the character, the set, and the assets were being modeled, this was the perfect time to start figuring out the shot progression and the timing of the entire cinematic. And figuring out the timing of every single shot and knowing how many shots go into the whole cinematic, get that approved, that would save us a lot of time later down the line. And so we created multiple rough animatics using only placeholder 3D assets or boxes and spheres because we didn't have any actual assets yet, but we needed to know what the client is looking for early on. And so once we got one approved, not only could we now start thinking about music because the total timing wasn't going to change that much now, but we now also had a way better idea of which areas of the cinematic we can focus on, which areas we can put less detail in the background, for example, or even which parts not to model at all because it won't be shown in the cinematic. So this really helped us run lean and only focus on parts that we need to focus on, saving us a ton of time throughout the project. So our next step was to model and rig the hands and also come up with a rough placeholder for a wooden block, because in the cinematic, the character is being chiseled out of wood by the creator and then comes to life with magic. So now we have to worry about VFX and somehow shaping the wood to turn into the character by the end of the cinematic. This presented a lot of problems. So first of all, for us to make the hand animation and work on that, we needed a wooden block that deforms all the way into the character. That's one of the problems. The next problem is we don't have a character to pose, and so we don't know the final pose that wood needs to mold into. So we don't have a rig, we don't have a model for that rig, and we don't know what pose the character is gonna be later in the cinematic for the wood to deform into that shape. Well, time was of the essence, so we had to come up with something. What we did was we focused hard on creating a very rough and untextured and unrefined version of the character, modeling it, and then putting a very rough rig without any actual facial rig, just a body, put a rough rig on it, and just put it together with sticks and tape essentially, and create a bunch of hero poses and send it to the client for one of them to get approved. We needed to know what pose the character was going to be at the end of the cinematic. It wasn't perfect, but one pose got approved, and now we knew what the final blend shape of the wooden block is going to look like. So with placeholder models and placeholder rigs and knowing the timing of the shots, we decided to create a very rough animatic of the whole cinematic, that all rhymed, and send that to the client for that to get approved. And so it was at this stage that we realized, you know what, we're actually going to take out the very last shot of the cinematic. We're just going to have the character open their eyes and take a breath instead of jumping at the camera and slashing at the camera. That just didn't work as well. Constantly approving these little steps and this little progression at a time definitely slowed us down in the short term, but I think in the long term it saved us a ton of time. Our client was fairly particular in what they wanted, so if we had taken creative liberty in a lot of these things and spent days or weeks on some of the stuff before sending it over, we could have lost those days and weeks of work and had to redo everything. So we were constantly, every other day or so, we were sending updates of what we're doing and what we're planning on doing and getting approval before moving forward. The wooden block. How we made the wooden block. In the cinematic we posted, some of you were asking how the wooden block was achieved, and well, here's a quick overview. We used a Boolean modifier to use a cube as a cutter, roughly carving the shape of the character based on the reference pose. We also created 32 iterations total and connected their visibility to a property. So what that means is we could now control each iteration level with a controller, with a rig, while animating. For the final few iterations of the wooden block, the character model was used and simplified using the decimate modifier to give it a carved look while capturing more refined details of the character. And for the material, we used a carved wood texture from Blender Kit. Once the wooden block rig was complete, we brought it into the main scene and we animated each iteration going forward throughout the time-lapse period and animated the hands according to the iteration on the wooden block, depending on what it looked like. Quick little introduction. If you're looking to learn how to animate like we do, without having to spend the tens of thousands of dollars we did learning in college, check out toanimate.ca. We spent nearly 3 years making a laser-focused, beyond college level curriculum on animation at less than 1% of the cost of college. So give toanimate.ca a look and see if our ultimate animation course would be beneficial for you. Now let's get back into the video. How we did the time lapse. This section of the cinematic was actually one of the hardest to tackle because we weren't sure if we'd be able to sell the idea that there's a time lapse section in the middle of the animation, and we had to come up with a way to make sure that came across in the final piece. Though it was hard, we utilized 3 tricks to try and make it work, and I think we did an okay job. The motion. We didn't start chiseling instantly at Mach 10 speed. We started slowly and methodically. Right before the time lapse started, we had the hands pull away from the wooden block as almost an anticipation of the action to come. Then we did one very quick chiseling motion followed by essentially pose to pose animation with a lot of motion blur added. The sound. In the beginning, we hear the creator, the person making the sculpture, enter the scene whistling and pulling out the chair to sit down. What we did was we continued the whistling up until the point of time lapse. Afterwards, we evolved the tune of the whistle into an instrument instead. Which could be an indicator that we're not in real time anymore and you don't hear the creator whistling anymore. The visual. On top of the wood shavings we added over time and jitter as they would during a time lapse, we also played a trick with the lighting. During the time lapse, we see the light from the window pass across the screen, giving the feeling of time passing and the sun traveling across the sky. And so these 3 auditory and visual tricks, I think, really sold the idea of the time lapse to the viewer. Maybe you can let me know down below if we did a good job or if you would have done it differently and how so. So for this project, we had 2 different people animating different sections. And at the end, we gave the file to our TD so that he can stitch it together and add the VFX as well. Now, because we were working with a lot of constraints, the hands picking up the chisel, putting it down, the hammer, moving the books and whatnot during the time lapse, there was a lot of constraints and a lot of pieces moving. So what we had to do, because we were running into a lot of issues, was bake the animation and bake the constraints as well before sending the file to our TD. This made it so that it was as frictionless as possible and required very little time of adjusting on our TD's side. There was very little going wrong once everything was baked in and we had the final version. Now, at this point, even though we tried our best, we were still a little behind schedule and we didn't have time to experiment with different VFX and different rendering and whatnot. So we had to expedite this by using Fox renderfarm. Using the renderfarm allowed us to have more time essentially testing VFX and re-rendering scenes way faster than we would have on our own computers. All that R&D process was kind of condensed into a couple of days instead of multiple weeks. Now, we're not sponsored by Fox renderfarm, but we do have a partnership with them for our toAnimate students. Our students get discounts on all their services and they get free credit when they sign up. But even if you're not a student, we still really recommend them, and we'll have a link in the description for you guys to check them out because they did truly save our skin in this project. That being said, we're also working on a tutorial on how to use their website while using Blender. So bring in your Blender scene into their website to render exactly like we did for our project. If you have any questions about the process, let me know down below, or what you think of this sort of video where we make a cinematic and then talk about it afterwards. I hope you enjoyed this video and you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.